Sanananda Tract, New Guinea, November 28, 1942, 14:17. The air didn't move. It hung thick and wet, a wool blanket soaked in fever and rot. Corporal Jack Digger Riley of the 2-9th Battalion, 7th Australian Division, tasted the mud on his lips. It was in his throat, under his nails, and caked in the webbing of his harness. He lay pressed against the slick black roots of a banyan tree, the world reduced to a 50-yard tunnel of suffocating green. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was deceptively gentle, a carpenter tapping wood. It was the sound of Type 92 bullets splitting the bark just above his head. "Keep your bloody head down, Bluey," Jack hissed, not daring to turn. "Doing my best, mate," Sergeant Bluey Johnson grunted from the mud hole 5 yards to his left. "Got any rounds?" Jack didn't need to check. He knew the weight of his pouches by heart. 1 mag in the Owen, maybe half a dozen for the Lee Enfield. Right, so we're buggered then. It wasn't panic, it was a statement of fact. They had been buggered for 3 days. The 7th Division, the veterans of Tobruk and Syria, had been thrown into the meat grinder of the Bunagona campaign. They were supposed to be the tough, jungle-trained elite who would finally clear the Japanese from the northern coast. But the jungle was neutral, and it hated everyone. Wump crack. A Japanese knee mortar, the pop gun the men had learned to dread, exploded nearby. Hot metal shrieked through the canopy, showering them in splintered wood and severed vines. A man screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short. "Stretcher bearer!" someone yelled, voice cracking. The reply was a bitter laugh. "Bearer's gone, and where do you think you're taking him?" Jack squeezed his eyes shut. The problem wasn't just the enemy and their fortified, invisible bunkers. The problem was everything else. The steam bath humidity had ruined their biscuits, turning them into green, moldy pulp. The labels had washed off the bully beef tins, making every meal a lottery between beef and, in one memorable case, plum pudding. Their quinine tablets, vital for suppressing the malaria that racked their bodies, had dissolved into a bitter paste in their pouches. But the water was the worst. The water was poison. Every shell hole was a brackish soup of mud and death. Every creek was a potential highway for dysentery. The purification tablets were gone. Brrrr. Jack's Owen submachine gun coughed out a 5-round burst as a shadow moved in the ferns. The shadow yelped and vanished. Jack didn't know if he'd hit it. He was too tired to care. He released the magazine. It was empty. He was now down to his rifle and 6 rounds. Riley. A voice, thin and strained. Lieutenant Davies, his platoon commander, was crawling toward him, dragging one leg. His face was a waxy yellow-gray mask of fever. "Sir?" "The Yanks. They're supposed to be on our right flank. The 32nd. Supposed to be pushing up." Davies coughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Gotta make contact. Got to know if that flank is open. They've got everything. Radios, supplies." Jack stared at his officer. "Contact, sir? Through that?" He gestured at the jungle, which was now thrumming with the thwack, thwack, thwack of the Nambu machine gun again. "Just find them," Davies whispered, slumping against the root. "Find them." Jack looked at Bluey. Bluey shook his head, a tiny, weary gesture. This was a fool's errand. A good way to get shot by your own side, or the enemy, or both. But it was an order. Jack checked his one remaining water bottle. It was a quarter full, the water inside warm and metallic. He took a sip, swished the grit from his teeth, and spat. "Right," he said to the jungle. "Going for a bloody walk." He eased himself backward, sliding like a snake into the deeper undergrowth, leaving the relative safety of the firing line. The sound of the battle faded, replaced by the sucking of his own boots in the mud and the frantic, pounding terror in his chest. To understand the hell of Sanananda, one had to understand the path that led to it. The Kokoda track. It was not a track or a trail in any civilized sense. It was a 96-kilometer scar of mud climbing over the spine of the Owen Stanley Range, a vertical malarial world where the rain never stopped and the sun never penetrated the triple canopy jungle. The strategic situation in late 1942 was desperate. The Japanese had landed on the northern coast of New Guinea, aiming to capture Port Moresby on the southern coast. and directly threaten Australia. They had pushed down the Kokoda track, coming within sight of Moresby's lights. Then, the Australian militia, conscripts, and later the veteran Australian Imperial Force, AIF, did the impossible. They fought the Japanese to a standstill and, in a brutal toe-to-toe slogging match, pushed them back over the mountains. Now the battle had reached the end. The Japanese had dug in on the coast, in a fortified labyrinth of coconut groves and swamp known as the Triangle, centered on the villages of Buna, Gona, and Sanananda. Here, the roles were reversed. The Australians were the attackers, and the Japanese, masters of defensive warfare, were the defenders. But the central problem was not tactics, it was logistics. The Kokoda track was a one-way street of misery. Everything the Australians needed, bullets, beans, bandages, had to be carried on the backs of native porters, the fuzzy-wuzzy angels, or, more often, on the backs of the soldiers themselves. Airdrops from the U.S. 5th Air Force were scattershot. More supplies landed in the jungle or in enemy territory than were recovered. The supply line was a leaking hosepipe, reduced to a single drop by the time it reached the front. Into this nightmare stepped the Americans, specifically the U.S. 32nd Infantry Division. They were a National Guard unit, green, ill-equipped for the jungle, and poorly trained for what they were about to face. General Douglas MacArthur, directing the war from his headquarters in Brisbane, Australia, demanded a quick victory. He split the command, sending the Australians against Gona and Sanananda, and the Americans against Buna. The result was a catastrophe. The 32nd Red Arrow Division, thrown against bunkers they couldn't see, melted away. They were ravaged by malaria, dengue fever, and scrub typhus. Their supplies, while seemingly plentiful compared to the Australians, were often the wrong supplies. They had the wrong clothing, insufficient medicine, and artillery that was useless in the swamp. This created a toxic atmosphere between the Allies. The exhausted, cynical Australians saw the Americans as Yanks, who had all the gear but no idea how to use it. They were chocolate soldiers melting in the heat. The beleaguered Americans, taking horrific casualties, saw the Australians as dismissive, arrogant colonials who refused to help. The high commands were no better. MacArthur, frustrated with the lack of progress, famously told the U.S. commander, General Harding, "I want you to take Buna, or not come back alive." This was the strategic, logistical, and psychological wall that Corporal Jack Riley was now crawling through. He wasn't just trying to find a flank, he was trying to bridge a gap between two armies fighting separate wars on the same patch of ground, all while being starved, hunted, and rotted by the jungle itself. Sanananda Track, November 28, 1942, 1503. For an hour, Jack crawled. He moved parallel to the unseen enemy, guided by the sound of gunfire from his own platoon, now fading behind him. He was in a dead zone, a patch of swampy lowland between the Australian position and where the Americans were supposed to be. The silence here was worse than the noise. It was the silence of ambush, of snipers tied into the canopy above. He passed the evidence of routine failure. First, he found the airdrop, a cluster of parachutes, once white, now mildewed green, draped over the trees. Below them, wooden crates lay shattered, their contents precious. 303 ammunition and tins of bully beef, scattered and sinking into the black mud, a total waste. 10 minutes later, he found the signal wire, a thin black cable laid by a signals team days ago, meant to connect his company to Battalion HQ. He followed it for 20 yards until it simply ended, cut by a mortar blast. The line was dead, another failure. He saw the bodies of two native carriers, their vital work cut short, the bags of rice they had carried now split open, the white grains mixing with the dark earth. The frustration was a physical weight, heavier than his pack. The high command, the planners, the base wallahs in Moresby, they had no idea. They drew lines on maps, but they couldn't draw a line that would stop the rot, or the fever, or the mud. The 7th Division was dying on its feet. Jack's platoon had started the push with 30 men. He counted 11 still on the line, and half of those were walking wounded, their skin the color of old parchment from the malaria. Every day the jungle took more than the bullets did. Men would sit down to rest and simply not have the strength to stand up again. They were being consumed. The desperation was palpable. It was in the way Bluey had asked for rounds, knowing there were none. It was in the way Lieutenant Davies, a man Jack respected, had given him a suicidal order, not out of malice, but because he was out of options. The entire campaign was stalled, not for a lack of courage, but for a lack of everything else. Jack paused, leaning his helmet against a vine. He was breathing heavily, the air thick as soup. The malaria was on him again, the faint cold shiver starting in his spine. He needed to find the Yanks. He needed to find them, or he needed to turn back. Turning back meant telling Davies they were alone. He pushed on, climbing over a massive moss-covered log. He slid down the other side into a shallow depression and nearly landed on top of someone. The man was sitting against a tree, his legs splayed out unnaturally. He wore the unfamiliar light green herringbone twill of the U.S. Army, a Yank. His helmet was gone. His M1 rifle lay in the mud a few feet away. His face was pale, almost translucent, covered in sweat and dirt. He was young, younger than Jack. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. His left pant leg was soaked in a dark, sticky mess. A field dressing was wrapped clumsily around his thigh, but it was failing. Jack raised his Enfield, his thumb on the safety. The man's eyes snapped open. They were wide with terror. "No, no, please," the American whispered, his voice a dry croak. His accent was a bizarre drawl Jack had only heard in movies. Jack lowered the rifle. "Easy, mate. Easy. I'm Aussie." The American blinked, the terror receding, replaced by a vast, exhausted confusion. "Aussie?" "Yeah. Digger." Jack pointed to his own slouch hat, tucked into his belt. "You hit bad." "Reckon so," the American whispered. Got separated. Sniper. Hit my buddy, then me. Been here. Don't know. Long time." He tried to move and a pained hiss escaped his lips. It's busted. The bone." Jack looked back the way he'd come. He couldn't carry this man, not a chance. He was 100 yards from the enemy and 1,000 yards from his own lines. "Where's your unit?" Jack asked. "Supposed to be that way." The American gestured weakly to the right. "We was trying to flank a bunker, got chewed up." He started to cough, a dry, racking sound that shook his whole body. When he finished, he licked his lips, his tongue like sandpaper. "Water," he rasped. "Please, water." Jack froze. He thought of his own platoon. He thought of Davies, shaking with fever. He thought of his single, quarter-full canteen. This Yank was done for. Giving him water was a waste. It was pure, simple, logistical stupidity. Bluey would call him a bloody idiot. The American looked at him, his eyes pleading. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a kid, dying of thirst in a swamp. Jack's hand went to his belt. He could hear Bluey's voice in his head. "Don't be a mug, Jack. We need that." He looked at the dying American. He looked at the jungle, indifferent and cruel. "Bugger it," Jack muttered. He unhooked his canteen. Jack Riley was not a sentimental man. He was a sheep shearer from Charleville, Queensland. His unconventional skill was an encyclopedic knowledge of how things break and how to fix them with whatever was handy. He could fix a broken shear, a busted truck axle, or a jammed machine gun with fencing wire, curses, and sheer bloody-mindedness. He was a product of the Australian bush, pragmatic, laconic, and deeply skeptical of authority. He respected sweat more than rank. He had survived the dust and flies of Tobruk by learning to make do. You didn't have a part? You made one. You didn't have water? You learned to drink less. This mindset made him the perfect jungle soldier, but it also made him fiercely protective of his own. His unit was his platoon. The Yanks were just another problem, like the mud or the mosquitoes. But as he looked at the wounded American, something else took over. It wasn't pity. It was a different kind of pragmatism. It was the simple animal recognition of need. He knelt, the mud sucking at his knees. "Here," Jack said, pressing the canteen into the American's hand. "Don't scull it, just sip." The American's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't get the cap off. Jack sighed, took it back, and unscrewed the Bakelite lid. He held it to the boy's lips. The Yank drank. It was a terrible sound, a gulping, desperate noise. "Easy, mate," Jack said, pulling it away. "Easy." "God," the American breathed, water dribbling down his chin. "God, thank you." He leaned his head back. "Names, Tex Malone, from El Paso." "Jack Riley," Jack replied. "Queensland." You're a long way from home, Queensland." Jack managed a grim smile. "So are you, El Paso." Tex tried to smile back. "My CO, he said the Aussies were tough." "We're all right," Jack said. He looked at the wound again. It needed a tourniquet, or the kid would be gone in an hour. Jack didn't have a tourniquet. He tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt, already rotting with sweat, and began to wrap it tight around the top of Tex's thigh, just above the shattered wound. Tex screamed, a muffled, agonizing sound. "Sorry, mate. Got to." Jack tied it off, using his bayonet to twist it tight. Tex panted, his face white. You're not leaving me?" This was the moment, the spark. Jack looked at the kid. He was a liability, a dead weight. But he was also the first American Jack had spoken to as a person, not an abstract Yank. And he had information. He knew where the American lines were. "No," Jack said, the idea forming, ugly and dangerous. "I'm not leaving you, but you're not staying here." He thought of Davies. "Make contact." "Right, Tex," Jack said, his voice changing, the shearer's practicality taking over. "This is going to hurt. A lot. But we're going to find your mates." He looked at the M1 rifle in the mud. He slung his own Enfield over his back, picked up the American rifle, and checked its action. It was a Garand, a heavy, self-loading weapon, a beautiful piece of kit. "You Yanks," Jack muttered. "You get all the good toys." He jammed the M1's bayonet into the mud and used the rifle as a crutch. He looped his arm under Tex's and hauled him to his feet. Tex cried out, his weight collapsing onto Jack. I can't," Tex gasped, his foot dragging. "Yes, you can," Jack said, his voice flat and hard. "You walk or you're a dead man. One step, then another." Jack Riley, the man who hoarded his last 6 bullets and his last drops of water, had just made the most illogical, unprofessional, and profoundly human decision of his war. He had traded his last resource for a wounded man from another army. He was no longer just following orders, he was improvising. U.S. 32nd Division Sector, November 28, 1942, 16:30. They moved for an hour. It was a grotesque, 3-legged crawl. Jack carrying the M1, half dragging, half carrying Tex, who drifted in and out of consciousness. Every snap of a twig was a sniper. Every bird call was a Japanese signal. Jack was running on pure adrenalized spite. He was not going to die here, not for this. Then he heard it, an American voice. "Goddamn radio's wet again. Tell him we're still held up at the stream." "Oi!" Jack yelled, his throat raw. "Don't shoot! Aussie, with one of yours!" He stumbled through a curtain of vines and fell into a clearing. It was a U.S. machine gun post, a big .30 caliber Browning pointed right at his chest. 2 American GIs stared at him, their eyes wide. "Holy!" one of them said. "Where the hell did you come from?" "He's got Tex!" the other one yelled, recognizing the wounded man. "Medic! Get a medic!" Men swarmed them. Jack let go of Tex, who collapsed onto a stretcher that seemed to appear from nowhere. A medic, looking impossibly clean, was already at work, cutting the pant leg, applying sulfa powder, and giving Tex a shot of morphine. Jack stood there, swaying, covered in Tex's blood and his own sweat. He was surrounded by Yanks. They were all staring at him. They looked young, and they looked fed. Despite their own supply issues, they had rations he hadn't seen in months. An officer pushed through, a young lieutenant with a neat mustache and a worried expression. "I'm Lieutenant Frank Miller," the officer said. "Quartermaster Corps, attached to the 128th. "What? Who are you?" "Corporal Riley, 7th Division. Platoon's back that way," Jack pointed. About a click. "We're holding, but we're light on. Real light." Miller was staring at the tourniquet Jack had made from his shirt. Then he looked at Tex, who was now stabilized, the morphine dulling his pain. "You brought him in," Miller said. "It wasn't a question." From where? Out there. Sniper got him. Through that? Miller looked at the jungle. Alone? Yeah. A tough-looking U.S. sergeant with stripes up his arms spat a stream of tobacco juice. Took a lot of sand, Digger. That's Malone's platoon. We thought they were all gone. Tex, his eyes hazy, grabbed the lieutenant's sleeve. Sir, Miller, that Aussie. He saved me, gave me his water. The circle of GIs went silent. Miller looked at Jack. His expression was unreadable. In this war, an act like that was so far beyond the norm it was suspicious. He gave you his water? Miller repeated. My canteen's dry, Tex whispered. Been dry since yesterday. He shared. Jack felt awkward. He hated this. He shrugged, suddenly aware of the state of his own uniform, torn and filthy compared to their relatively fresh gear. He was thirsty. Miller continued to stare. The bureaucratic mind was clicking. This was an anomaly. Sergeant, Miller said to the tobacco-chewing NCO, get Corporal Riley a hot meal and a full canteen. 2 canteens. Sir, the sergeant said, his eyes not leaving Jack. The skepticism was still there, but it was mixed with something new. Respect. Riley, Miller said, turning back to him, you said your platoon is light on? This was the first step, the proposal. Jack, exhausted, saw the opening. Light on, Jack confirmed, his voice rough. We got no ammo, no food, no quinine. We're holding a line that your flank is supposed to be on, but you're not there. We're hanging in the breeze, sir. He didn't say it as an accusation. He said it as a fact. Miller frowned. Our maps show your 212th Battalion is supposed to be miles east. We've had no contact with the 7th Division for 48 hours. The radios are useless. Well, we ain't the 212th. We're the 209th, and we're right where I said. The skepticism was now aimed at the maps, not at Jack. Miller, the logistics officer, saw a problem he could solve. A localized, tactical problem. You're telling me, Miller said slowly, that a platoon of AIF veterans is holding the line a kilometer from here, and they are out of supplies. That's what I'm telling you, Lieutenant. Miller looked at Tex, now being prepped for evacuation. He looked at the .30 caliber, which had plenty of belted ammunition. He looked back at the exhausted, mud-caked Australian who had just walked out of hell to save one of his men. Sergeant, Miller said, find me Captain Lewis, now, and get the keys for the jeeps. U.S. 32nd Division Sector, November 28, 1942, 1840. The prototype was not an invention of steel. It was an invention of trust, and it was built in a captured Japanese bunker that the 128th Regiment was using as a command post. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of damp canvas, and the sharp, clean scent of American coffee. Jack sat on an ammo crate, nursing a mug of the stuff. It was heaven. A U.S. medic had checked him over, given him 2 salt tablets and a packet of cigarettes. Opposite him sat Lieutenant Miller and a broad, tired-looking man with captain's bars, Captain Lewis. And that's the situation, sir, Miller was saying. Corporal Riley's platoon is acting as a de facto flank for our entire push up this axis. If they break, the Japanese can roll right in behind us. Captain Lewis dragged a hand over his face. And you're sure? You trust this digger? Jack bristled, but Miller spoke first. He carried PFC Malone a kilometer through no man's land, sir, on a busted leg, after giving him his own water. I trust him. Lewis nodded, the doubt fading. Okay, so they need supplies. Why hasn't their own command sorted it? Same reason ours is a mess, sir, Jack said, finding his voice. The track. The drops are all over the place. The carriers can't get through. It's all gone to hell. Lewis looked at his maps. But they're AIF. They're not under my command. I can't just give them U.S. Army property. Sir, Miller said, leaning forward, forget the regulations. This is logistics. We have a friendly unit in a key tactical position that is about to be rendered combat ineffective for lack of basic supplies. We, on the other hand, have a relative abundance of those supplies. It is in our direct tactical interest to ensure they can hold that line. This was the language the captain understood. Not charity. Tactics. What do they need? Lewis asked Jack. Jack had been thinking about nothing else. Ammo, first, 303. For the Enfields and the Bren. and 9mm for the Owens. Miller winced. We don't have .303 or 9mm. We use 30, .06, and .45. A silence fell. The entire plan stalled on a simple difference in caliber. Bugger, Jack said, the hope draining out of him. But, Miller said, his mind working, we have grenades, we have M1 rifles, we have 45 submachine guns, and we have K rations, and quinine. Jack looked up. The grenades will work. So will the rations and the quinine. But the rifles, our boys aren't trained on them. They're soldiers, aren't they? Lewis said. A rifle is a rifle. Give them a 5-minute lesson. It's better than nothing. The prototype was being improvised. It wouldn't be a resupply. It would be an equipment exchange. Okay, Miller said, standing up, the decision made. Here's the plan. We can't spare a full truck convoy, but we have 2 jeeps. We'll load them up. He turned to his supply sergeant, the one who had been skeptical of Jack. Sergeant, I want 2 jeeps. Load them with 10 crates of K rations, 500 morphine syrettes, a case of sulfa, all the quinine we can spare, and 10 M1 Garans with, say, 2,000 rounds, and 5 crates of fragmentation grenades. The sergeant's jaw dropped. Sir, that's half our reserve. It's an investment, Sergeant, Miller said. You saw Malone. That Digger's platoon just saved our flank. Now we're going to save theirs. He turned back to Jack. We can't get the jeeps all the way. The track is too narrow. We can get them to the stream, about half a click from here. You'll have to guide us in, and your men will have to hump the supplies the rest of the way. They'll do it, Jack said, standing. He felt a surge of energy the coffee and food couldn't provide. It was hope. They'll carry it on their bloody teeth if they have to. One more thing, Riley, Captain Lewis said, pointing a finger at him. This is unofficial. This never happened. If my CO finds out I've given 10 brand new Garans to the Australian Army, I'll be court-martialed. Jack nodded. Understood, sir. It's a field acquisition. Good. Lewis gave him a grim smile. Now get it done, Lieutenant, before the enemy figures out what we're up to. Sanananda Track, U.S. Sector, November 29th, 1942, 0412. The pre-dawn dark was total. The jungle was alive with the sawing of insects and the drip of water. Jack, Lieutenant Miller, and 8 American GIs, the supply sergeant included, stood by 2 Willys jeeps. The vehicles were loaded to the springs, their canvas tops down. The engines were off. This is as far as the vehicles go, Miller whispered. The track turns to soup just past here. From here we walk. Right, Jack said. He sniffed the air. The familiar putrid smell of the front line was stronger now, mixed with the American smell of diesel and canvas. My boys are maybe 400 yards. Straight ahead. How do we know they won't shoot us? The U.S. sergeant muttered, cradling his own M1. Because I'm going to cooey, Jack said. You're gonna what? Jack put 2 fingers to his lips and let out a high-pitched cooey. The sound, the classic Australian call of the bush, cut through the jungle noise. A moment of silence. Then a faint cooey in return. That's Bluey, Jack said, grinning. He's alive. Right, let's move, grab the boxes. The first test was purely physical. The 10 men, 9 Americans and 1 Australian, began to hump the heavy crates of ammo, food, and medicine through the final, treacherous stretch of jungle. It was backbreaking work. The men slipped, fell, and cursed in the dark. The mud sucked at their boots. The quinine and morphine were light, but the .30-06 ammunition crates were brutally heavy. Jack found himself next to the skeptical sergeant. They were both carrying a crate of grenades between them. Your boy Malone, the sergeant grunted. He's a good kid. From my hometown, Santone. El Paso, he said. Yeah, well, close enough. Texas. The sergeant stumbled, and Jack took the weight. Point is, we appreciate it, Digger. Point is, Jack grunted back, we're all in the same bloody mud. Let's get this to the line. They reached the Australian perimeter, a series of flooded foxholes. Men rose like ghosts from the ground, their eyes wide and unbelieving. Jack? You mad bastard, you're back. It was Bluey. His face was skeletal in the faint light. Brought some mates, Bluey, Jack said, dropping his end of the crate. Lieutenant Davies crawled over, his eyes burning with fever but clear for the first time in days. Riley, what is this? "Lieutenant Miller, sir." "U.S. Army," Miller said, stepping forward and saluting. The gesture looked absurdly formal in the mud. "We believe you're in need of some supplies." The Australian soldiers, starved and exhausted, just stared. It was like a cargo cult miracle. The Yanks were here. "Get it sorted," Bluey roared, finding his voice. "Ammo, food, move." The men fell on the crates. Tins of K-rations were ripped open. Men who hadn't eaten in 48 hours were weeping as they bit into the dense chocolate and dry biscuits. "Quinine." The platoon medic was grabbing the small bottles, running to the men shaking with malaria. Jack grabbed one of the M1 rifles and a clip of ammo. He found Bluey. "Right. Listen up. This is a Garand. It's Yank. It's self-loading. It kicks like a mule, but it hits hard. You put the clip in here. It pings when it's empty." "Got it." Bluey held the heavy, well-oiled weapon. His eyes were wide. "It's beautiful, Jack." The first test was a success. The supplies were in. The men were eating. The line was holding. But the noise of the delivery, the urgent whispers and scraping of crates, had carried. Thwack, 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 thwack. The Japanese Nambu opened up, firing on the sound. "Stand to!" Davies yelled, his voice suddenly strong. "They've heard us! They're coming!" A green flare hissed up from the Japanese lines, casting a sickly light over the swamp. And in that light, they saw them. Shadows, moving through the trees. A full-scale enemy assault. Sanananda Track, Australian Sector, November 29, 1942, 05:01. Contact front. The jungle exploded. The Japanese, sensing a moment of disorganization, charged, yelling, "Banzai!" It was a probe, designed to find a weak point and tear it open. They had found one, but it had just been reinforced. "Give 'em hell!" Bluey Johnson roared. He stood bolt upright in his foxhole and fired the M1 Garand. Blam, 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 blam. The semi-automatic fire, so different from the slow, methodical bolt action of the Enfields, ripped into the first wave. The attacking Japanese, expecting a weak response, faltered. "Grenades!" Jack yelled. He pulled the pin on a U.S. fragmentation grenade, heavier, more powerful than their British Mills bombs, and hurled it. The crump of the American grenade was followed by the burt of the few remaining Owen guns, and now, the thunder of 10 new Garands. Lieutenant Miller and his supply team were caught in the middle of it. "Sir, we should pull back," the U.S. sergeant yelled, firing his own M1. "Pull back where?" Miller yelled back, drawing his .45 pistol. "We're in it. Fight." The supply NCO, the man who had doubted Jack, now found himself shoulder to shoulder with him in a muddy trench, fighting for his life. An enemy soldier, bayonet fixed, leaped over a log. Jack, his Garand empty, swung it like a club. The sergeant shot the man twice in the chest. "Thanks, mate," Jack panted. "Don't mention it, Digger." The psychological effect of the new supplies was as potent as the material one. The Australians, re-energized by the food and the sudden, shocking increase in their firepower, fought with a ferocity that had been dimmed by starvation. They weren't just holding, they were winning. The K-rations gave them energy. The grenades broke the assault. The quinine, already taking the edge off the fevers, steadied their hands. But it was the M1 Garands that broke the enemy's spirit. "Ping!" Jack's clip ejected. He fumbled for another, his hands shaking. A Japanese soldier rose up right in front of him. Before Jack could move, Bluey stitched him with a burst from his Bren gun. "Where'd you get the ammo for that?" Jack yelled. "This is the old stuff." Bluey grinned, his teeth white in his mud-caked face. "Saving it. But now we got more." The Japanese assault lasted 20 minutes. It was an eternity. But the line held. The combination of Australian tenacity and American firepower was unbreakable. As the sun began to filter through the canopy, the firing died down. The attack was broken. The jungle floor was littered with the cost of their probe. Silence fell, broken only by the panting of the men and the groans of the wounded. Lieutenant Miller, his hands trembling, holstered his pistol. He looked at Jack. His face was pale, but his eyes were blazing. "My God, Riley," Miller said. "Your platoon, they're magnificent." Jack just nodded, reloading his M1. "We do all right." He looked at the American supply team. You Yanks don't shoot half bad either, for quartermasters. The U.S. sergeant laughed, a short, sharp bark. The real trial was over. The prototype hadn't just worked. It had turned the tide of a battle. And it had forged a bond, not of paper, but of shared combat. Miller looked at the jeeps, visible in the distance. He looked at the Australian platoon, now cleaning their new weapons and finishing their first real meal in a week. This, Miller said, his mind racing again. This is just the beginning. The jeep run of November 29th did not stay quiet. It couldn't. Captain Lewis, on hearing Miller's after-action report, was not court-martialed. Instead, he was quietly commended by his regimental commander. The report, heavily edited, stated that joint logistical operations with attached AIF units had successfully repulsed a major enemy counterattack, securing the regimental flank. The dominoes began to fall. First, within the 32nd Division, Miller's investment became a model. Other U.S. company commanders, hearing of the success, began making unofficial contact with Australian units on their borders. The friction between the two armies, so toxic just days before, began to dissolve at the platoon level. A digger from the 212th, hearing the rumor, walked 2 clicks to a U.S. mortar position. He offered a captured Japanese flag and 3 bottles of Australian rum, hoarded for months, in trade for 2 boxes of .45 ammo for their Thompson guns. The trade was made. The greatest effect, however, was on Jack's unit. Australian 7th Division HQ, Tent, December 2nd, 1942, 10. "Let me get this straight, Corporal," said a red-faced Australian major, an intelligence officer. "You deserted your post, found an American unit, and bartered for U.S. Army property?" Jack stood at attention, clean-ish, for the first time in weeks. "Sir, I was ordered to make contact by Lieutenant Davies. I made contact. The Americans offered logistical support. It seemed rude to refuse, sir." The major stared at him. Beside him, Jack's battalion commander, a grizzled colonel, was trying not to smile. "This Lieutenant Miller," the major continued, "claims you saved one of his men, and that your joint action saved his company's flank. They were a bit exposed, sir. We helped out. He has also," the major said, picking up a piece of paper, "filed an official request with his command, which has been forwarded to us. He is requesting the permanent attachment of Corporal Jack Riley as a liaison officer to his quartermaster unit to facilitate inter-allied supply coordination." Jack's stomach dropped. "A liaison, sir? With the Yanks? I'm a rifleman." "Not anymore, Riley," the colonel spoke up, his voice a low gravel. "You, with your little stunt, have just done what the General Staff has been failing to do for a month. You've opened a reliable supply line. The Yanks, God bless them, trust you. They like you, and they have jeeps." Jack was stunned. "As of 0800 this morning," the colonel said, "we have opened Route Riley. It's an ad hoc track, widened by engineers, connecting your old position with Miller's supply depot. It's now the primary supply route for the entire battalion." The innovation was spreading. What started as one man sharing a canteen had become official policy, at least at the divisional level. Jack Riley, the shearer from Queensland, was promoted to sergeant and given a new, impossible job: keep Route Riley open. A fictional report from General Harding, U.S., to General Blamey, AUS, might have read, "It has come to my attention that low-level, forward-echelon cooperation between our forces has yielded significant tactical results. The initiative shown by junior officers and NCOs in the Sanananda sector, bypassing official channels to provide immediate mutual support, is to be encouraged. This frontline logistics model is proving more effective than our centralized and currently broken airdrop system." The dominoes were falling, and they were all falling Jack's way. Route Riley was less a road and more a 5,000-yard trail of mud, corduroy logs, and constant nerve-shredding danger. It was Jack's baby, and it was a hungry one. He and Lieutenant Miller were now partners. Their field modification was to create a hybrid system. U.S. jeeps would run the supplies, food, medicine, and now, thanks to some high-level wrangling, 303 ammunition flown in from Moresby, to a transfer point. At the transfer point, Australian teams, often aided by fuzzy-wuzzy angels who trusted the digger man Jack, would break down the supplies into man-portable loads and hump them the final dangerous click to the front. "It's the weak link, Jack," Miller said, staring at the map in their shared tent. "That last click. It's all on foot. It's slow, and it's exposed." Jack nodded, chewing on a piece of American gum. "It's the only way. The jeeps can't go further. So we modify the jeeps." The next day, Miller produced a mule, a standard Willys jeep that his mechanics had stripped down. They had removed the windshield, the passenger seats, even the hood, and welded on simple steel panniers. It was lighter, narrower, and could carry twice the ammo. It was a frontline hot rod. Jack's contribution was human. He recognized the Yanks, new to the jungle, were terrified of snipers. His men, veterans of this warfare, were not. "You drive," Jack told Miller's men. "My boys ride shotgun." Literally, 2 men per jeep, 1 driver, 1 digger with an Owen gun, watching the trees. The hybrid Aussie-American jeep teams became the lifeblood of the offensive. They were fast, they were lethal, and they were efficient. But the enemy was not stupid. The Japanese, starved and desperate, but masters of infiltration, noticed. This new, reliable flow of supplies had stiffened the Australian-American line. The constant pop of the Owen guns and the whoomp of U.S. mortars meant the Allies were no longer weak. This supply line had to be cut. Route Riley, December 9, 1942, 11:03. Jack was in the passenger seat of a Jeep mule, Miller at the wheel. They were bringing in a precious load of blood plasma. "It's too quiet," Jack said, his eyes scanning the canopy. "I like quiet," Miller replied, fighting the wheel. "No, this is bad quiet." Thwack, thwack, thwack. The Nambu opened up from their right, 20 yards away. At the same time, a mortar round exploded just behind them. "Ambush!" Jack yelled. "Gun it, Frank! Gun it!" Miller slammed his foot on the accelerator. The Jeep leaped forward. Another machine gun opened up from the left. They were in a perfectly prepared L-shaped ambush. A Type 94 light tank, which the Japanese had somehow kept hidden in the swamp for weeks, rolled out from behind a stand of bamboo, blocking the track. "Bail!" Jack screamed. He and Miller dove from the moving Jeep into the mud on the side of the track. The Jeep, loaded with plasma, slammed into the tank and shuddered to a halt. Rounds were kicking up mud all around them. "We're pinned, Jack!" Miller yelled, his face pale. "No, we're not!" Jack was furious. They had hit his route. He pulled 2 grenades. "Cover me!" "With what?" Miller screamed, firing his .45 at the tank, the bullets pinging harmlessly off its armor. "Just yell!" Jack scrambled, low-crawling through the muck, using the Jeep as cover. The Japanese in the tank, arrogant, opened their hatch to get a better view. Jack pulled the pin on the first grenade. He counted to 2. He threw it. It landed short. The Nambus were concentrating on him now. Bark and mud flew into his face. 1 more. He pulled the pin on the second. 1, 2, 3. He stood up, hurled the grenade, and dived back down in one motion. The crump of the explosion was followed by a metallic clank and a series of screams from inside the tank. The hatch, which had been open, was now a mangled wreck. The Nambus fell silent. Jack and Miller lay panting in the mud. "You," Miller said, breathing heavily, "are certifiably insane." "It worked, didn't it?" Jack said, getting to his feet and grabbing his Owen. "Now, let's clear these other bastards out." The attack was a failure for the Japanese, but it was a costly warning. The innovation had a price. It was drawing heat. Route Riley was a success, and success in war breeds new problems. The first cost was human. The ambush on Jack and Miller was just the start. The Japanese began to specifically target the Jeep teams. Over the next week, Jack lost 4 of his men, and Miller lost 6. These losses weighed on Jack. They weren't riflemen lost in a charge. They were men running his route, men he had personally assigned to a Jeep. He started to drink the Australian rum he was supposed to be using for trade, sitting alone in his tent, looking at the roster. The second cost was overconfidence. With a steady flow of supplies, the U.S. command, now under General Eichelberger, who had replaced Harding, launched a massive frontal assault on Buna. It was better supplied, but still a bloody, brutal affair. The fresh food and ammo just meant the men could fight and die in better condition. Jack, now a sergeant, felt a creeping sense of moral ambiguity. His job was no longer to fight. His job was to barter. He was a liaison, which meant he was a glorified scavenger, navigating a labyrinth of inter-allied politics. U.S. 32nd Division Supply Depot, December 15, 1942-09. I'm sorry, Sergeant Riley, a new U.S. major, a fresh face from Moresby, told him. The 7th Division is not on my requisition list. The 500 pairs of boots you've requested are allocated to the 126th Regiment. Major, Jack said, trying to control his temper. My men, the 7th Division, have been in this jungle for 3 months. Their boots have rotted off their feet. They are fighting in canvas shoes or bare bloody feet. The 126th just got here. They can wait a week. The regulations are clear, the major said, looking down at his clipboard. U.S. property for U.S. units. Regulations? Jack stepped closer. My men are dying, holding your flank, so your 126th can have a flank to attack from. This isn't about regulations. It's about winning the bloody war. Your tone is insubordinate, Sergeant. Frank! Jack yelled, turning. Tell him. Lieutenant Miller walked over, his face grim. Major, Sergeant Riley is a personal liaison attached to this command by order of General Eichelberger. His requests are my requests. Now, are you going to release the boots, or am I going to have to get the general on the field phone and explain why the 7th Division is out of action with trench foot? The major paled. I'll see what I can do. Jack walked out of the tent, shaking with rage. Miller followed him. It's not like it was, Frank, Jack said, lighting a cigarette. No, Miller agreed. It's not. It's bigger now. It's not just us. It's a system. And systems have friction. Jack looked at the long line of trucks and jeeps, the mountains of crates. I preferred it when I was just a corporal, Frank. I knew who the enemy was. Now, I'm not so sure. He was no longer a rifleman. He was a politician, a horse trader. He had to beg, cajole, and threaten to get his own men what they needed to survive. He had succeeded so well that he had become part of the bureaucracy he despised. The water he had shared with Tex Malone was a simple act. This was complicated, and he wasn't sure he was any good at it. The battle for Buna, Gona, and Sanananda reached its bloody climax in January 1943. The Japanese, starved into fanaticism, fought to the last man. The final bunkers were cleared not by bullets, but by flamethrowers and tanks that had been brought up the coast, their fuel and ammunition supplied by the very logistical network Jack and Miller had pioneered. Route Riley had become the artery of the final push. When Sanananda finally fell, the cost was laid bare. The Australian 7th Division and the U.S. 32nd Division had been effectively destroyed as fighting units. They had taken staggering casualties, more from disease and exhaustion than from combat. But they had won. The beachheads were secure. The threat to Australia from New Guinea was over. For his actions, Sergeant Jack Riley was awarded the military medal by the Australians. But the recognition that meant more came in a small formal ceremony at the newly built airstrip, Sanananda Airstrip, February 1943-14. Jack stood awkwardly as General Eichelberger, the U.S. commander, pinned a medal to his fresh khaki shirt. For extraordinary initiative and heroism in combat, fostering a bond of brotherhood between Allied forces and ensuring the logistical support that proved decisive in the Sanananda campaign. Eichelberger read, "The United States Army is proud to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross." Jack was speechless. The DSC was the second highest honor an American soldier could receive. It was almost never given to a foreigner. Lieutenant, now Captain Frank Miller beamed and shook his hand. Told you they'd like you, Jack. The immediate legacy was profound. The Buna model of integrated frontline logistics became a template for the rest of the Pacific War. Never again would U.S. and Australian commands operate in such ignorant, isolated silos. The innovation that Jack had stumbled into, prioritizing frontline need over bureaucratic regulation, was written into the training manuals for jungle warfare. The mule jeep became a standard modification, and the idea of liaison NCOs, trusted men who could walk between units and get things done, was adopted across the Southwest Pacific area. A single act of sharing water had, in a real and measurable way, changed how the Allies fought the war. It saved a platoon, then a battalion, and finally, it helped win a campaign. Jack, however, was just tired. He wanted to go home. Charleville, Queensland, Australia. 1985. The sun was hot, the air dry. It was good, clean heat, nothing like the wet rot of New Guinea. Jack Riley, now in his late 60s, sat on the veranda of his farmhouse, watching his sheep graze. His hair was white, his face a map of wrinkles, but his hands were still strong. On the table beside his mug of tea was a small wooden box. Inside, a military medal, a distinguished service cross, and a dried, pressed jungle flower. A young historian from Canberra sat opposite him, a tape recorder running. "And so, Sergeant Riley," the historian said, "the official histories credit Route Riley as a turning point. They say your initiative broke the logistical stalemate. Would you agree?" Jack took a slow sip of tea. He looked out at the vast, peaceful distance. "It wasn't a stalemate," Jack said, his voice a low rasp. "It was a bloody mess. We were dying. The Yanks were dying. Everyone was angry. But your act, sharing the water with PFC Malone, that's what started it all. It's become a legend, you know. The digger and the canteen. They teach it at Duntroon, a lesson in Allied cooperation." Jack was silent for a long time. The historian fidgeted, worried he had offended the old man. "He was thirsty," Jack said finally, his voice quiet. "I had water. Simple as that. But the consequences," Jack interrupted, his eyes sharp, "were Frank Miller. Frank was a good man, a smart man. He saw a problem and fixed it. I just showed him where the problem was. And the fighting? The ambush with the tank? You do what you have to do." Jack shrugged. "War's a terrible, wasteful thing, son. You spend all your time trying to kill a bloke you've never met, and the only thing that makes any sense is helping the bloke next to you. Sometimes he's wearing your hat, sometimes he's a Yank." He picked up the wooden box and looked at the American medal. "I got letters from Frank Miller right up until he passed. Heart trouble. And Tex. The boy. Malone. He went home to El Paso. Lost the leg. But he had a family. Wrote me every Christmas. Sent me a Stetson hat one year. Looked bloody ridiculous." Jack smiled, a faint, sad smile. "History," Jack said, "is what you write down. What happens, that's just people. People being decent. Or people being animals. In New Guinea, we were both. But I reckon the decent part, that's the only bit that sticks. The only bit that's worth a damn." The historian looked at his notes, at the man who had, in his own small way, bent the arc of the war. He saw not a hero, but a man. A pragmatic, tired, decent man. "He was thirsty," Jack said again, as if to himself. "I had water." The historian switched off the recorder. In the silence of the Australian outback, the only sound was the wind, a world away from the sucking mud and dripping rain of the track that still bore his name.